Just moments ago, a revelation sent shockwaves through Westminster. The $22 billion black hole that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have cited to justify sweeping tax hikes and spending cuts may not exist at all. This isn't mere political spin. It's a potential fabrication that has misled the nation. In this video, we delve into the evidence that exposes this alleged fiscal gap as a calculated deception, unraveling a narrative that has far-reaching implications for the UK's economic future. In the immediate aftermath of Labour's electoral victory, Chancellor Rachel Reeves stood before Parliament, asserting that the new government had inherited a £22 billion deficit from the Conservatives. This claim served as the cornerstone for a series of austere fiscal policies, including significant tax increases and reductions in public spending. However, scrutiny reveals that this figure may have been strategically inflated. The Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, the UK's independent fiscal watchdog, has cast doubt on the accuracy of the $22 billion claim. According to the OBR, the actual fiscal shortfall left by the previous administration was closer to $9.5 billion. This discrepancy raises critical questions about the integrity of the data presented by Reeves and the motivations behind its presentation. Further analysis indicates that the so-called black hole was not an unforeseen discovery, but a narrative constructed to facilitate a predetermined policy agenda. By presenting an exaggerated fiscal crisis, the Labour government created a rationale for implementing policies that might otherwise face significant public resistance. The implications of this revelation are profound. If the $22 billion deficit is indeed a fabrication, then the policies enacted under its pretense lack legitimate justification. This includes the controversial increase in employer national insurance contributions, which has placed additional burdens on businesses already grappling with economic uncertainty. Moreover, the alleged deficit has been used to validate cuts to welfare programs and public services, decisions that have tangible impacts on the most vulnerable segments of society. The erosion of trust resulting from this potential deception could have lasting effects on public confidence in government transparency and accountability. As we continue to investigate, it becomes increasingly clear that the $22 billion black hole may be less a reflection of fiscal reality and more a strategic construct designed to advance specific political objectives. In the following sections, we will explore the mechanisms by which this narrative was propagated and the broader consequences for the UK's economic landscape. When Chancellor Rachel Reeves unveiled the Labour government's inaugural budget, she presented a stark picture, a $22 billion black hole in public finances, purportedly inherited from the preceding Conservative administration. This figure served as the linchpin for a series of sweeping fiscal measures, including significant tax hikes and spending cuts. However, upon closer examination, the legitimacy of this deficit claim has come under intense scrutiny. The Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, the UK's independent fiscal watchdog, has raised questions about the accuracy of the $22 billion figure. While acknowledging certain fiscal pressures, the OBR's analysis suggests that the actual shortfall may be closer to $9.5 billion. This discrepancy casts doubt on the narrative of an unprecedented fiscal crisis and raises concerns about the potential manipulation of economic data for political ends. Critics argue that the Labour government may have strategically inflated the deficit figure to justify its policy agenda. By portraying a dire financial situation, the government could rationalize unpopular measures such as increased taxes on businesses and reductions in public spending. This tactic, if true, represents a significant breach of public trust and undermines the principles of transparent governance. Further compounding these concerns is the lack of clarity surrounding the methodology used to calculate the $22 billion deficit. The government's refusal to provide detailed breakdowns or engage in open discussions about the figures has fueled suspicions of deliberate obfuscation. Transparency is a cornerstone of democratic accountability, and the absence of it in this context is troubling. The implications of a potentially fabricated fiscal crisis are profound. Policies enacted under the guise of addressing a non-existent deficit could have far-reaching consequences for the economy and society. Businesses facing increased tax burdens may curtail investment and hiring, while cuts to public services could disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. Moreover, the erosion of trust in government narratives can have lasting effects on public engagement and confidence in democratic institutions. If citizens perceive that economic data is being manipulated for political gain, it may lead to increased cynicism and disengagement from the political process. In light of these developments, it is imperative for the government to address the discrepancies in the deficit figures transparently. Providing a detailed account of the calculations and assumptions underlying the $22 billion claim would be a crucial step toward restoring public trust. Additionally, independent audits and reviews by fiscal watchdogs can help ensure the integrity of economic data and policy decisions. As the debate over the legitimacy of the $22 billion deficit continues, the Labour government faces mounting pressure to substantiate its claims and justify its policy choices. The stakes are high, and the need for transparency and accountability has never been more critical. The public deserves clear, honest communication about the state of the nation's finances and the rationale behind significant fiscal decisions. Only through such openness can confidence in economic governance be maintained and strengthened. As the smoke begins to clear around the supposed $22 billion black hole, the attention shifts directly to Sir Keir Starmer himself. His public statements, media appearances, and the overall tone of his messaging are now under the microscope, and the cracks are beginning to show. What initially seemed like a bold declaration of fiscal responsibility is now looking more and more like a carefully staged performance, one with inconsistencies, contradictions, and political sleight of hand. For a leader who promised honesty and transparency, the sudden change in narrative smells suspiciously like damage control. Starmer repeatedly claimed that the budget shortfall was inherited from a mismanaged Conservative legacy, casting Labour as the reluctant saviour cleaning up someone else's mess. But insiders and economic analysts have started picking apart this claim. Multiple sources have noted that Starmer and Reeves had access to detailed financial forecasts months before they assumed office, forecasts which included the looming deficits. This means the Labour leadership had ample time to develop an alternative plan. Instead, they waited until after taking power to spring the black hole narrative on the public, which now appears to be less about facts and more about laying the groundwork for unpopular economic measures. Observers have also pointed out a stark shift in tone from Starmer. Before the election, he painted a hopeful picture: growth, green jobs, investments in infrastructure. But after stepping into Downing Street, his rhetoric quickly pivoted to one of crisis and constraint. This bait-and-switch strategy is not only misleading, but it also raises serious ethical concerns about how Labour presented its platform to voters. Was the party ever truly committed to its progressive economic promises, or were those simply campaign tools to win votes? Even more troubling is the coordinated messaging between Starmer and Reeves. In recent press briefings, the pair have echoed each other's language almost verbatim, speaking of fiscal discipline, responsible choices, and tight constraints. Such scripted repetition suggests that this is not an honest reflection of economic reality, but rather a manufactured message designed to condition public perception. This is classic political damage control. Flood the media with consistent rehearsed language so that the spin starts to feel like truth. Journalists have begun probing these talking points more aggressively. In a heated exchange with reporters, Starmer sidestepped direct questions about why the deficit number ballooned so drastically between pre-election discussions and post-election announcements. When asked to provide clear documentation to support the $22 billion claim, he deferred to Reeves. Reeves, in turn, offered vague references to Treasury modeling and emerging fiscal pressures, but failed to present any concrete data. This circular deflection has only deepened suspicions that the numbers were selectively exaggerated. Meanwhile, Starmer's approval ratings, which enjoyed a brief post-election bump, are now beginning to slide. The public is starting to feel the effects of the so-called emergency measures, rising taxes, shrinking public services, and renewed austerity. The feeling on the ground is that Labour is reneging on its promises, using the spectre of a budget crisis to justify actions that were never part of the mandate they were elected on. The betrayal stings even more because Starmer had cultivated an image of integrity and reform. To see him now fronting policies that mirror those of previous Conservative governments is not just ironic, it's infuriating to many. Even Labour's backbenchers are growing uneasy. Whispers of discontent have emerged, with some MPs privately admitting they were blindsided by the scale of the spending cuts and the lack of internal discussion beforehand. This suggests that Starmer's inner CI. What emerges from all this is a troubling portrait of political misdirection. Starmer has positioned himself as a leader of stability and truth, but the unfolding budget saga reveals something far more calculated. The narrative of a nation in crisis may not be rooted in facts, but in strategy, a deliberate move to lower public expectations and excuse policy reversals. And in that space between the promise and the reality, public trust is eroding fast. This is not just about a budget. It's about the integrity of a leader who claims to be different from those who came before him. And if Starmer's version of the truth is one shaped by political convenience rather than economic necessity, then his government risks being remembered, not as a force for renewal, but as just another chapter in the long story of broken promises. The coming weeks will be pivotal, not just for Labour, but for the entire political landscape of the UK. While the political theatre continued to unfold on television screens and in the pages of national newspapers, one voice dared to push through the noise. That voice belonged to Sarah Thompson, a veteran investigative journalist with a long record of uncovering high-level financial scandals. Known for her relentless pursuit of the truth and her refusal to be intimidated by party lines or establishment pressure, Sarah became the linchpin in exposing what is now being described as one of the most calculated misrepresentations in recent UK economic history. What began for Sarah as a routine review of Labour's post-election budget turned into a labyrinth of half-truths, statistical manipulation, and bureaucratic silence. When the $22 billion figure was first broadcast during Rachel Reeves's budget announcement, Sarah, like many others, felt an unease that was hard to ignore. The number was shocking, yes, but also suspiciously convenient. It offered Labour the perfect scapegoat, a fabricated legacy of Conservative chaos to justify their sudden shift in policy direction. So, instead of taking the number at face value, Sarah did what few others dared. She questioned it. She began by requesting detailed fiscal breakdowns from the Treasury, only to be met with vague statements and heavily redacted documents. What was made available to the public was shockingly superficial, lacking the level of depth typically expected from a budget of such magnitude. That was the first red flag. Then came the inconsistencies in public statements. In one interview, Reeves claimed that the $22 billion included emerging liabilities from unfunded programs. In another, she suggested it was based on projected revenue shortfalls. These explanations didn't match up, and that only deepened Sarah's determination. Digging into publicly available data, Sarah analyzed prior fiscal reports from the Office for Budget Responsibility and examined the financial models used by the Treasury before Labour came into power. To her surprise, none of those documents mentioned or even hinted at a deficit of that size. In fact, most of them projected a much smaller gap, one that would typically be addressed with moderate adjustments, rather than sweeping structural reforms. This finding was a game-changer. It suggested that the $22 billion figure was a recent invention, not a revelation. Then came the breakthrough. While combing through a dense, overlooked appendix in a recent Treasury paper, Sarah found a minor footnote that directly contradicted one of the assumptions Labour had used to justify the deficit. According to this footnote, a significant portion of what was being labelled as structural shortfall had already been accounted for in existing departmental reserves. In simple terms, the same money was being double-counted to make the deficit look larger than it was. It was a sleight of hand, a trick of the spreadsheet, and it had gone unnoticed by the wider public. Fueled by this discovery, Sarah reached out to confidential sources inside the civil service. What she learned was damning. At least 2 insiders confirmed that internal Treasury communications had flagged the inflation of deficit projections as politically advantageous. These communications were not made public, nor were they disclosed in any official records, but their existence pointed to a deliberate strategy: create a crisis narrative, amplify the fear, and then use that fear to justify a slate of economic measures that otherwise would be politically toxic. This wasn't just about a number being slightly off. It was about a calculated distortion of the truth with enormous consequences for millions of Britons. Taxes had already begun rising, public service budgets were being slashed, energy bills were expected to spike due to new levies disguised as climate incentives, and all of it was being justified by a deficit that, by all credible accounts, had been wildly overstated. As Sarah's investigation gained traction, other journalists and economists began corroborating her findings. Independent think tanks, once cautious about confronting a newly elected government, started publishing their own reviews of the $22 billion figure. One report described it as a political construct rather than an economic necessity. Another labeled it a fiscal phantom. The illusion was beginning to unravel, but the damage had already begun. Sarah's work didn't stop at uncovering the numbers. She also exposed the communications machinery behind the narrative. Leaked memos from Labour's media team showed a clear directive: use consistent language, emphasize inherited problems, and downplay internal dissent. This coordinated messaging campaign revealed just how thoroughly the party had planned to control the story. And yet, as compelling as Sarah's findings were, the government remained silent. Reeves refused to directly address the inconsistencies. Starmer dodged questions by repeating the same phrases: difficult choices, economic realities, fiscal discipline. The silence spoke volumes. It confirmed what many were already beginning to suspect. The government had no intention of correcting the record. The narrative had served its purpose, and now they were betting the public would simply forget. But that gamble may prove to be Labour's greatest miscalculation. The public isn't forgetting, it's growing angrier. And with journalists like Sarah Thompson refusing to let the truth be buried, the pressure is only mounting. What began as a footnote in a budget report is now a roaring storm of controversy, threatening to consume the very leaders who tried to engineer it. The truth, once released, is difficult to contain. And in this case, that truth may not only dismantle the illusion of a $22 billion deficit, it could unravel the credibility of an entire administration. As we move forward, the fallout from Sarah's investigation is only beginning to be felt. What comes next may redefine the future of UK politics and shake the foundations of power in ways no one anticipated. The illusion has been shattered, the numbers don't lie, and now it's up to you to keep the pressure on. If this exposé has opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the polished speeches and staged press conferences, then don't stay silent. Share this video with everyone you know, your friends, your family, your community. The mainstream won't cover this the way it should, but together we can make sure the truth spreads faster than their lies. Leave a comment below. Do you believe Starmer's government has fabricated this crisis to push a hidden agenda? Or is there still more to uncover? Your voice matters, and your engagement is what keeps the spotlight burning. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story isn't over, not by a long shot. In the next episode, we'll reveal the fallout inside Labour's own ranks and the secret memos that could bring this entire narrative crashing down. Stay alert, stay informed, and never stop questioning the headlines.